dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. Oh, hello, listener. I didn't see you there, but you are welcome. Welcome to this, something completely different. It's a little Spooktober trick that I've cooked up. Really just a flight of pure narcissism and me liking to hear the sound of my own voice. This is something that I like to do. I get great enjoyment from people reading me scary stories, so I thought that it might be a little treat more for me than for anyone else to read you a scary story on this Halloween. So come, listeners, sit beside me at this fire and hear a tale more... I don't know if I can keep this up forever. A tale more creepy than outright scary. It's a very interesting short story that I had to read for a class several years ago, but I haven't quite been able to get it out of my mind since. It's, like I said, more creepy than anything, more, just weird, really. It's by a Japanese poet by the name Sakutaro Hagiwara. But I don't want to bore you with more biographical details, but I do invite you, listener, to sit beside me, beside this fire, huddle up. I'm wearing a Snuggie. You should be wearing a Snuggie as well. And let's listen to a ghost story. This story, Cat Town, as no piece of writing should, opens with a quote from Schopenhauer. You may smash a fly, but the fly's thing in itself will not die. You'd simply have smashed the phenomenon called a fly. Part 1. The allure of travel gradually faded away from my roman. Once upon a time, my heart danced just by imagining any of its symbols, a train, a steamship, towns of unknown foreign lands. Nonetheless, my past experience has taught me that travel is no more than the simple movement of the same thing within the same space. No matter where you go, you find the same kinds of people live, repeating the same kinds of monotonous lives in the same kinds of villages or towns. In any small town in the countryside, the merchant is fiddling with his abacus at his storefront, looking out at the whitish street all day. The public servant is smoking in his office, thinking about things like vegetables in his lunchbox, as they live each tasteless, monotonous day in the same way, day after day, watching their lives gradually grow old. The allure of travel came merely to project in my tired heart the image of an endlessly bored landscape, like a Chinese parasol tree that grows in some vacant lot, making me feel a tasteless hatred and leeriness for human life in which identical rules repeat themselves no matter where you turn. In short, I lost interest in any kind of travel, the romance of it. For a long time I've continued only mysterious travels through my own unique method. In these travels of mine, I let myself go in the only moments where human beings can fly outside time and space. Outside cause and effect, that is. That free world that subjectivity constructs, skillfully taking advantage of the borderline between dream and reality. That said, I no longer will need to talk a lot about my secret, except I might just add that in my case, instead of opium, which requires you to do a great deal of trouble for utensils and equipment, and which at the same time is hard to get in Japan, I most often used morphine and cocaine, which you can use by simple injection or orally. As for the countries I traveled in, the ecstatic dreams induced by narcotics, I don't have enough room to detail them here. But in most cases I traveled in marshy areas swarming with frogs, or a coastal region near the Arctic where penguins are. In the landscapes of those dreams, all colors were in brilliant primary hues, and both sea and sky were transparent pale blue like glass. Even after I woke from them, I remembered these visions, often experiencing eerie illusions in the real world. These travels on drugs, however, terribly harmed my health. Every day I grew emaciated, turned paler, and my skin grew decrepit and stagnant. I began to pay attention to my own care, and in the midst of a walk for exercise, one day suddenly I discovered a new way of satisfying my odd travel addiction. Following the advice the doctor specified for me, I would walk about in an area 4,000 to 5,000 yards away from home, or 30 minutes to an hour every day. That day, too, I was, as always, walking in an in the usual walking area. The route I took was always the same. But that day, I, for some reason, passed through an alley unknown to me. As a result, I completely lost track of my route, messing up the directions. From the start, I've been a human being whose sensory functions that intuit magnetic directions have something remarkably deficient. In consequence, I don't remember roads well, and in a place unfamiliar to any extent, I easily get lost. In addition, I have the habit of falling into meditation while walking on the road. An acquaintance may greet me without my noticing it at all. At times, I become lost in my neighborhood, very near my house, and ask for directions, making people laugh. Once I walked around the house where I'd lived for a long time, round and round, along the fence 50, 60 times. Because of the error in my directional sense, I could not, for the life of me, find the entrance to the gate that was right in front of my eyes. My family said I was no doubt duped by a fox. The state of being duped by a fox must be what psychologists call a disorder in the semicircular canals. This is because, according to scholars' theory, the special function of sensing directions is the effect of those semicircular canals. Such extraneous matters aside, I was lost and confused, making a random guess. I hurried along the road, trying to go in the direction of my house, and after making several rounds of a suburban area with mansions with many trees, I surprisingly came out on a bustling street. It was a beautiful town in some place utterly unknown to me. The street was swept clean, and the pavement was wet with dew. Every store was neat and fresh, and each show window, I think that's supposed to say shop window, with polished glass, had a variety of rare merchandise arranged in it. Near the eaves of a cafe, a flowering tree luxuriated, adding a tasteful touch of light and shadow to the town. The red post box at the crossroads was also beautiful, and even the young woman in the cigarette store was bright and delicate like an apricot. I had never seen a town with such deep feeling. Wherever in Tokyo was such a place. I had forgotten the geography, but by calculating the time I knew for certain, without any doubt, that it was in the neighborhood of my house, that it was in the usual area of my walk, only about 30 minutes away on foot or somewhere near it. But how was it possible that such a town existed so close, utterly unknown to me? I felt I was dreaming. It seemed to me it was not a real town, but a town in a picture projected on a screen by a magic lantern. But at that instant, my memory and common sense were recovered. I looked again, and it was a suburban town near my place that I knew very well, unattractive and run-of-the-mill. As always, the postbox stood at the crossroads, and in the cigarette store a young woman with some stomach ailment was sitting. And in the show windows of the stores was the usual merchandise on display that had gone out of fashion, dusty and yawning. The eaves of the cafe were decorated with an arch of artificial flowers fit for the countryside. It was just the usual, boring town in which everything was as I knew it. In a single instant, the entire impression had changed. And this magical, mysterious change was caused only because I'd been lost on my way and had confused the direction. The postbox that usually was at the southern edge of the town seemed to be in the north, at the entrance from the opposite end. The houses lining the street, which were usually on the left side, had moved to the opposite, right side. And this simple change had made the entire town appear a rarity, something new. In that unknown, illusory town, I was looking at the sign of a certain store. I thought I'd seen exactly the same picture of the sign somewhere. And the moment my memory was restored, all directions were reversed. The street that until then had been on the left side was on the right side, I discovered, and I, who had been walking north, was walking south. That instant, the needle on the magnetic compass turned around, and the spatial positions of east, west, south, and north were entirely reversed. At the same time, the entire universe changed. The feelings of the phenomenal town became something utterly different. That is, the mysterious town I'd seen before had actually existed in the reverse space of the universe where the magnetic compass was turned upside down. After this accidental discovery, I often deliberately got directions confused to travel in this mysterious space. These travels were particularly convenient for my purpose because of my deficiency I've described before. But even those with an ordinary, healthy directional sense must have seen at times this special space in their own experiences. For example, you're on a train late at night on your way home, When it leaves the station, the train at first runs on the rails straight from east to west, but after a while you wake from your dozing dreams, and you begin to realize that the direction of the advancing train had been reversed before you knew it, with the train running in the opposite direction, from west to east. In your rational thinking, you know it isn't possible. Yet as a sensory fact, the train is certainly going the other way, distancing itself from your destination. At such a time, look out the window. The stations and landscapes on the way that are so familiar to you have now entirely, fascinatingly changed, presenting an utterly different world of which you don't have a fragment of memory. But when you finally reach your destination and get off on the usual platform, for the first time you wake from your dream and recognize the real, correct direction. And once you realize this, the abnormal landscapes and things you saw turn into unattractive, ordinary, familiar, and banal things. That is, you see the same landscape first from its reverse side, and then from its front side, according to the normal custom. Nothing contains a greater metaphysical mystery than the fact that a single thing presents two separate sides if you change the direction of your eyes, that a single phenomenon has a hidden secret side. A long time ago, when I was a child, I would look at a framed painting hanging on the wall and become obsessed with the thought, what kind of world is secretly hidden behind that framed landscape? I often removed the oil painting to peer at its back. This question I had as a child remains for me, an adult today, as an unsolvable mystery. The story I narrate next provides a key that suggests an answer to my mystery. If the reader is able to hypothesize from my mysterious tale a certain four-dimensional world, the reality behind the landscape that hides behind things and phenomena, the entire tale will be real. But if you are unable to hypothesize it, the facts that I actually experienced will in the end be no more than a hallucination of the incoherent decadence of a poet whose central nerves are damaged by morphine addiction. At any rate, I'll muster my courage to write it down. Except not being a novelist, I don't know how to amuse the reader with embellishments and schema. All I can do will be to write a report of the facts I experienced. At the time, I was staying at the Hot Spring K in the Hokuetsu region. In the mountains near the end of September, past the equinox, it was already well into the autumnal season. All the resort people from the metropolis had gone home, with only a handful seeking a hot spring cure, quietly staying on to look after their illnesses. The shadows of the autumn sun were slowly growing deeper, and in the desolate courtyard of the inn were dead leaves of trees scattered about. In a flannel kimono, I would take a daily walk in the mountain behind, idly passing the days. A little distance from the hot spring, there were 3 small towns. They were not so much towns as small congregations of farmhouses, more properly called villages, but one of them was really a snug rural town selling an array of daily necessities, with even a couple of urban-style eateries. From the hot spring, a road directly led to each of these towns, and every day a horse carriage traveled back and forth on a set schedule. A small light railway connected to the busiest town, U. I often went to U Town by rail to shop or drink at a joint with barmaids, but my true joy was on the way to the town. The cute, toy-like train ran, snaking through deciduous woods and between mountains with a view of a valley. One day I got off the train midway to walk to U Town. I wanted to take a leisurely stroll, alone, over a mountain path which had a good view. The road lay more or less alongside the railway as it followed an irregular path through the woods. Here and there, autumn flowers were in bloom. There was clay exposing its shiny flesh, and there were trees cut and laid aside. Looking at the clouds floating in the sky, I was thinking of an old folk tale transmitted in that mountainous region. The region, which was on the whole culturally undeveloped and wrapped with taboos and superstitions of a primitive people, had in fact a variety of legends and folk tales. Many people there still seriously believed. Indeed, the maids at my inn, as well as the people from neighboring villages taking the hot spring cure, told me various stories with feelings of fear and disgust. According to what they said, the residents of one village were possessed by a dog deity, and the residents of another by a cat deity. Those possessed by a dog deity lived by eating only meat, and those possessed by a cat deity only fish. Those people called such outlandish villages possessed villages, and avoided all intercourse with them, hating and detesting them. The people of possessed villages choose a dark, moonless night once every month to hold a rite. The rite is utterly invisible except to themselves. On a rare occasion some outsider might see it, but such a person, for some reason, keeps silent about it. They have a unique magical power and have a huge amount of assets, sources unknown, stashed away somewhere, and so forth. After telling me such stories, they would add, "In fact, a village of that kind existed near this hot spring until just recently. Its residents have scattered away someplace now. You can guess why. But they must be continuing their secret group life. For an unmistakable proof of this, we know someone who saw their okura, the identity of the demon. In the talks of these people, there was a strain of stubborn assertiveness unique to the farmers. Regardless of my wishes, they tried to impose on me their own superstitious fears and their realities. But I had a different reason to listen to their stories with interest. Village taboos of this kind, which are found in many parts of Japan, can probably be linked to the descendants of the people who had as their ancestors tribal deities, those who had moved here from foreign countries or had naturalized and whose customs and habits were different. Or, to make a more credible speculation, they may be linked to the villages of hiding Christians. But in this universe, there are a great many things that are unknown to mankind. As Horace said, the intellect knows nothing. It turns everything into common sense, and provides vulgar interpretations to mythologies. And the hidden meaning of the universe is always above vulgarity. Therefore, all philosophers must surrender to the poet when they arrive at the end of their intellectual exploration. Only the universe that the poet intuits far above the common senses is the true metaphysical reality. Deep in such thoughts, I was walking along the autumn mountain path. The narrow path went on to lead into the depths of the woods. The railway that I had counted on as the only road sign to my destination was nowhere visible. I had lost track of my way, a lost child. What came to my mind when I awoke from my meditation was these helpless words. I suddenly became uneasy and flustered as I started to look for the path. I turned back and tried to return to the original road. In doing so, I lost my sense of geography and found myself mired in a maze that seemed to lead every which way. The mountain became deeper, and the small path disappeared into thorns. Useless time passed. I didn't even meet a single woodcutter. My unease increased. As agitated as a dog, I walked about trying to sniff out the road, and finally I found a narrow trail where the clear footprints of men and horses. Paying attention to the footprints, I gradually descended toward the foot of the mountain. No matter to which side of the mountain I might go down, I'd be relieved as long as I could get to a place with houses. Several hours later, I reached the foot of the mountain, and truly, I discovered an unforeseen, unexpected human world. There, instead of poor farmhouses, was a beautiful, bustling town. Once, an acquaintance of mine who had traveled on the Siberian Railway told me how, after running through the vast, barren, uninhabited plains on the train day after day, a small station where the train stopped at long last looked like the busiest city in the world. My impression in this case was a comparable surprise. Toward the lower flatlands spread innumerable houses of different architectural designs, with towers and tall buildings shining in the sun. I could hardly believe that such a respectable city existed beside such a godforsaken mountain. Feeling as if I were watching a magic lantern, I slowly approached the town, and in the end I went into the lantern myself. Out of a certain narrow alley, I passed through a passageway as dark as the Buddha's womb, into the center of a bustling main street. My impression of the city streets reflected in my eyes was very special and rare. In each block, the stores and buildings were designed with aesthetically different feelings, yet the town as a whole formed a comprehensive beauty. Also, it was not consciously done, but was an accidental result from rust gathering through the ages. It had ancient elegance and depth, and spoke of the town's old history, of the past and its residents' long memories. The streets were generally narrow, even the main street only 4 or 5 yards wide at best. The other smaller streets were jammed all between the eaves, forming narrow crisscrossing alleys. They turned and twisted like a maze, sometimes going down a cobbled street, sometimes going through a dark tunnel, and formed beneath bay windows that jutted out from second floors. As in a town in a southern land, luxurious flowering trees grew here and there with wells near them. Everywhere the shadows were deep, and the town as a whole was as moist and quiet as the shade of green foliage. There was a row of brothel-like houses, and from somewhere deep within the courtyard came the sound of quiet, leisurely music. Along the main street, many houses were Western style with glass windows. In front of a barber shop, a pole with red and white stripes stuck out, and written on its painted sign was "Barber Shop." There was an inn, and there was a cleaner. At the crossroads of the town was a photo studio, and its glass-made house, like a weather station, reflected the blue sky of an autumn day in a somewhat lonesome fashion. At the front of a clock and watch store sat its bespectacled proprietor, silently, intently at work. The streets were bustling with people, crowded. Despite that, there was no noise whatsoever. It was all elegantly quiet, forlorn and hushed, with a suggestion of deep sleep. This was because, except for the people who were walking, not a single car or horse that made noise passed by. Not only that, but the crowds themselves were quiet. Both men and women all appeared refined and reserved, cultivated and unhurried. In particular, the women were beautiful. In addition to being ladylike, they were coquettish. Whether shopping in a store or talking on a street, they were all well-mannered, speaking in a well-modulated, low, quiet voice. Their talk and conversation had the air of not so much listening with the ear as exploring meanings with some sort of soft feeler through the touch. In particular, the women's voices somehow had the sweet, entrancing charm of caressing the surface of the skin. All the phenomena and personalities went back and forth like shadows. The first thing I noticed was that the atmosphere of the town as a whole was formed artificially with extremely sensitive attentiveness. Not just the buildings, but the entire nervous system that formed the town's mood was focused solely on a certain important aesthetic design. Attention was given to every corner lest the slightest stirring of the air break any of the aesthetic rules, such as contrast, balance, harmony, and parallelism. Furthermore, because the formation of its rules for beauty required an extremely complicated differential calculation, every nerve of the town was quivering with extraordinary tension. For example, even some falsetto slightly out of tune was prohibited because it would break the harmony. Whether walking on the street, simply moving a hand, eating or drinking something, contemplating, or selecting the design of a kimono, delicate attention always had to be given to keep in harmony with the atmosphere of the town and not destroy the contrast and balance with the surroundings. The entire town was like a dangerous, fragile building formed of a thin sheet of glass. The slightest loss of balance would destroy the whole house, shattering the glass into smithereens. To maintain its stability, each of its columns was required to be assembled with subtle mathematical logic, the whole structure being supported barely by the resultant contrast and balance. What was frightening besides was the truly real fact that structured this town. A single careless mistake would mean its collapse and death. The nerves of the entire town were taut with that apprehension and terror. The design of the town that appeared aesthetic was not that for a simple matter of preference, but hit a more terrifyingly acute problem. When I noticed this for the first time, I suddenly became uneasy and felt the pain of my nerves taut in the electrifying air that surrounded me. Both the unique beauty of the town and its hushed, dreamy quietness became eerie in a hushed sort of way, as if signals were being exchanged inside some frightening secret. A single unknown, vague presentiment busily rushed about in my heart, in the pale color of terror. All my senses were liberated, and I could perceive, completely, assuredly, the minutest colors, smells, sounds, tastes, and even the meanings of things. The air surrounding me filled up with a corpse-like odor, and the atmospheric pressure kept climbing by the second. What phenomenized there was surely some evil omen. Surely now something extraordinary would happen, had to happen. The town hadn't changed a bit. The streets were as thronged as before, refined people walking quietly, noiselessly. Somewhere in the distance there were consecutive low, sorrowful sounds like the rasping of a Chinese fiddle. Mine was a presentiment whose content was terrible anxiety, like that of someone who in some place alone, mystified and suspicious, is watching a town which, just a moment before a great earthquake strikes, remains as normal can be. Now accidentally a man falls, and the carefully constructed harmony is destroyed, throwing the entire town into chaos. In my own presentiment, I became exasperated, like someone who, conscious of a dream in his nightmare, is desperately struggling in his effort to wake from it. The sky was transparently blue and clear, and the density of the electrified air kept increasing even faster. The buildings began to become uneasily distorted, growing thin as if ill. Here and there, tower-like things became visible. The roofs, too, became eerily slender, looking oddly bony and deformed, like the legs of a skinny chicken. "Now!" I shouted despite myself, my heart pounding with terror, when a tiny black rat-like animal scurried away through the center of town. In my eyes it made a truly clear image. For some reason I had an abnormal, abrupt impression of something that threatened to break the entire harmony. That instant, all phenomena came to a sudden halt, and a bottomless silence laid itself down. I didn't know what it was, but the next instant, a frightening abnormality, which no one could imagine, and which was the most bizarre in the world, phenomenized. I looked, and the streets of the town were swarming with huge crowds of cats. Cat, 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 cat. No matter where I looked, there were only cats. And from the windows of houses, the cats' whiskered faces were floating out, enlarged as if they were pictures in picture frames. I shuddered. My breathing almost stopped. I was about to keel over. Is this not a world where human beings live, but a town where only cats live? What on earth has happened? How can I believe this phenomenon? I'm sure something is wrong with my brain now. I am seeing an illusion, or else I've gone mad. My own universe has lost its balance of consciousness and has collapsed. I became afraid of myself. I strongly felt some frightening final destruction was pressing very close upon me. A shudder flashed through the darkness, but the next moment I recovered my consciousness. Quietly calming myself down, I opened my eyes once more and looked again at the truth of the fact. By then, all those enigmatic cats had vanished from my vision. There was nothing abnormal about the town, and the windows were agape, vacant. There was nothing in the streets, only the roads of boredom whitening. Nothing like the cats were visible anywhere, and the emotional state had completely changed. But now commercial houses lined the streets, and tired, dusty people of the kind you'd see in any countryside were walking about the dry town in daylight. The mesmerizing, mysterious town had wholly disappeared, and, as if you'd turn over a card, a completely different world had emerged. What actualized itself here was the usual banal rural town. Furthermore, it was the usual U-town I'd known as well. There was the usual barber shop, with its chairs lined up for customers who didn't come, watching the street in daylight. And on the left side of the run-down town, the clock and watch store that couldn't sell its wares was yawning, its door closed as usual. Altogether, it was a monotonous country town, just as I'd known it, with nothing out of the ordinary about it. When my consciousness had become that clear, I understood everything. Stupid of me, I had once again suffered the usual sensory disease, the loss of semicircular canals. I'd lost my idea of direction ever since I was lost on the path in the mountain. I thought I'd gone down the opposite side, but had come back down to U-town, and I'd wandered into the center of town from a direction totally different from the station where I normally got off the train. As a result, I had looked at all the impressions from the opposite side, from a position where the magnetic compass was flipped upside down, and had seen another four-dimensional universe, the reverse side of the landscape. where the upside and downside, the four directions, the front and back and right and left were all reversed. That is, to interpret the matter with a run-of-the-mill common sense. I've been duped by a fox, as they say. My story ends here, but my mysterious question begins anew here. The Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi once turned into a butterfly in his dream, and when he awoke asked himself, mystified, am I the butterfly in the dream, or am I the one here now? This ancient enigma hasn't been solved by anyone in thousands of years. Is the illusory universe what someone duped by a fox sees? Or is it something intellect's common sense sees? When it comes to such things, does the real world in metaphysics exist on the other side, or this side, of the landscape? Probably no one can answer this enigma, and yet what still remains in my memory is that puzzling outside human town, that spectacle of a monstrous cat town where images of cats were vividly projected in the windows, under the eaves, and on the streets. My living perception can still recreate that frightening impression and make me clearly see it graphically in front of my eyes, even though 15 to 16 years have already passed since. People sneer at my story, saying that it's a poet's sickly illusion, a phantasmagoric illusion too silly for words, yet I surely saw a town where only cats lived, a town where cats in the guise of human beings thronged its streets, regardless of ratiocination or argument. To me, nothing is more absolute and doubtless than the fact that I saw it in some part of the universe. In the face of all kinds of derisions of all the many people, I still firmly believe in my mind that unique village on the Japan Sea of which oral legend has handed down, the town where only cat spirits live, must surely exist somewhere, in some part of the universe. Alright, listener, that's our story. Again, not spooky so much as it is creepy and weird. Not really a ghost story, although kind of a ghost story. A ghostly story, if you will. Thank you again for indulging me. I hope you got some enjoyment out of it. I know I really enjoy having stories read to me. Scary stories, just any kind of story, really. So I hope this was able to spook up your Halloween a little bit. And, yeah, thanks for listening. Okay, bye. The scariest thing of that was probably the mouth sound I made.
You will agree that the concepts will contribute to the rearing of a mature person.
An absence of...
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.
But it's in continuous